On the 4th of September 1981, the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the United Kingdom sat down and wrote a confidential letter to his Prime Minister. Somewhere in the middle of it, he wrote 2 words. And then, in the very next line, he wrote an instruction about those 2 words that no government minister should ever have to write. He wrote that this was not a term for use, even privately. Think about what that sentence means. Not a term for use in public, not a term for use in Parliament, not a term for use even privately, even between the 2 most powerful people in the country, even behind a locked door. The Chancellor had found the honest words for what the government was considering, and his first instinct was to make sure those words were never spoken aloud again. The letter was sealed into the government archive, where the law kept it hidden for 30 years. When it finally became public, in December 2011, people who had lived through what it described recognized it instantly, because you did not need the letter to know what had happened. If you grew up in Britain, you watched it happen. The steelworks at the end of the valley, the pit that employed half the town, the engineering works your grandfather walked to every morning for 40 years, the bike factory, the car plant, the shipyard. One by one they went quiet, and every time you were handed the same explanation: foreign competition, the unions, bad management, the tide of history. Nobody's fault. The letter says something different. By the end of this video, you will read those 2 words for yourself, exactly as they were written, and you will know precisely when Britain's government found its honest name for what was happening and chose to bury it. But to understand why those words were written at all, you have to understand that this is not a story about one government or one decade. It is a story about a choice that Britain made 5 separate times across 60 years. And it is a story about 2 floors. The first floor is a factory floor. It sits in a town called Consett, on a hilltop in County Durham, 700 feet above sea level. Iron has been made on that hill since 1840, when the Derwent Iron Company first fired its furnaces. By the 20th century, the works had grown into one of the great steel plants of Europe, and the town existed for one reason only: steel. The works employed the fathers, the plate mill employed the sons, and the whole place lived under a permanent light dusting of red iron oxide that settled on the washing lines and the windowsills and the roofs, so that from a distance the town itself looked faintly rust-colored. People in Consett did not think of the works as an employer. They thought of it the way you think of weather. It had always been there. It always would be. The second floor is a trading floor. It sits 300 miles south, in a single square mile of the City of London, and on it, men in top hats and later in striped shirts bought and sold something you cannot drop on your foot. Money itself, bonds, bills, shares, currencies. The city was the banker to the whole world. Sterling was the currency that empires and republics alike kept their savings in, and the invisible earnings of that square mile, the interest, the insurance, the shipping fees, the commissions, flowed back into Britain year after year without a single furnace being lit. Both floors were built by the same empire. Both were, in their own way, the best in the world. And the whole story of modern Britain, the story hidden inside that 1981 letter, is the story of what happened when the country was forced to choose between them. Because there was a time when Britain did not have to choose. In the middle of the 19th century, roughly a third of everything manufactured on Earth came from this one island. By 1870, Britain was producing close to half the world's pig iron. Locomotives built in British works ran on every inhabited continent. Textile machinery from Lancashire turned in mills from Bolton to Bengal. Sheffield meant steel. The Clyde meant ships. And underneath the output sat something harder to measure and far harder to replace. Craft knowledge, held in particular streets and particular families, passed from father to son through apprenticeships, alive in the hands of men who could not always explain what they knew, but could do it without thinking. Whole towns, like Consett, built around a single trade. Hold that picture, because everything that follows is measured against it. By 1900, the lead was already slipping. German steel output overtook Britain's in the 1890s. American manufacturing passed British output around the turn of the century, and the countries doing the overtaking were doing something Britain refused on principle to do. They protected their industries behind tariff walls. They directed the state toward manufacturing. They treated industry as a national project. Britain's answer was confidence. Free trade while others protected. A deep reluctance to let government steer industry at all. The assumption in Whitehall, and above all in the city, was that the lead was natural and would hold. And already, quietly, the interests of the two floors were pulling apart. The factory floor needed a competitive pound, cheap enough that British goods could win orders abroad. The trading floor needed a strong pound, prestigious enough that the world would keep its savings in sterling. You could favour one, you could not fully favour both. For decades, the choice was postponed. In 1925, it could not be postponed any longer. The man who faced it was Winston Churchill. Stanley Baldwin had appointed him Chancellor of the Exchequer in November 1924, and Churchill arrived with enormous political confidence and no formal training in economics whatsoever. On his desk sat one question: whether to return the pound to the gold standard at its old pre-war rate of $4.86. The Bank of England wanted it. The city wanted it. The old rate meant prestige, permanence, the empire's money restored to its proper place at the center of the world. To his credit, Churchill invited the opposing argument in, and the man who made it was the economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes told him that restoring the pound at $4.86 would overvalue it by roughly 10% against its real market level. And a 10% overvaluation meant something brutally concrete. It was a 10% cut in the effective earnings of every British export industry at a stroke. Coal, steel, ships, textiles. The workers in those industries would pay the difference through wage cuts, shorter hours, or no hours at all. The trading floor would gain. The factory floor would pay. Churchill heard the argument. He understood it. And in April 1925, he restored the gold standard at $4.86. The bill arrived almost immediately. The coal industry, already undercut by cheap German reparations, coal flooding the market, lost its last margin. The owners demanded wage cuts. The miners refused. In May 1926, the country went into the general strike, 9 days that confirmed Keynes's arithmetic in the streets. Keynes had already published the mechanism in plain English. in a pamphlet whose title told you everything. The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. Britain finally abandoned the gold standard in 1931, 6 years too late. The damage long since done. Mark this down as the first time. The city asked for the pound to be defended. Industry was sent the bill. And the conviction behind that decision, the belief that sterling's international standing must be protected at whatever cost, lands on the factory floor, did not leave when the policy did. It passed down through the Treasury like an heirloom. Then came the war, and after it, a strange reprieve. In 1945, Europe was rubble, but Britain's factories were standing, staffed and tooled. For the next 20 years, the factory floor had its golden age. Manufacturing made up around a third of the entire economy. At the peak, in the mid-1960s, roughly 8 million people went to work in British manufacturing, a number that is genuinely difficult to believe now. In Consett, the works ran at full stretch. Stand at the top of the town at 6 in the morning and you could hear it. The shift whistle, boots on the hill, the furnaces that never went out, glowing against the Durham sky at night so that the clouds above the town shone orange. But the trap from 1925 was still set, and now it had a new spring. Sterling was still a reserve currency. By the early 1960s, more than 40 countries held their national savings in pounds, which meant Britain could not let the pound weaken without breaking faith with all of them. So every time industry grew fast enough to suck in imports and put pressure on the currency, the Treasury reached for the brake. Interest rates up, credit tightened, expansion choked. The economist called it stop-go. In practice, it meant that a factory manager who needed a 5-year horizon to justify new machinery was living inside a 6-month window. So the machinery aged. British plants ran equipment their competitors had scrapped a decade earlier, not because British engineers were worse, but because the money that should have re-equipped the lines was being held back again and again to defend a number on a currency board. Harold Wilson walked into Downing Street in 1964, promising to break exactly this pattern, promising a Britain forged in the white heat of technology. Within weeks, his own advisors told him the truth. The pound was overvalued. Devaluation was necessary to free industry from the trap. He refused. What followed was 3 years of currency defense, dollar borrowings, support operations, the entire machinery of the state bent toward holding a number, and the modernization Wilson had promised was the thing that quietly paid for it. On the 18th of November 1967, the markets won anyway. The pound fell from $2.80 to $2.40. The next evening, Wilson went on television and told the country, in words that would follow him to his grave, that this did not mean that the pound in your pocket or purse or in your bank had been devalued. The line was technically true and everyone knew it was false. And the gap between those two things is where the public's trust began to go. Mark that down as the second time. 3 years of industry's future spent defending the city's number, and the number fell anyway. The third time looked, briefly, like it might go the other way. In 1970, Edward Heath's government arrived with a new doctrine, announced by his industry secretary, John Davies. The state would no longer prop up lame ducks, industries that could not survive without support. Everyone on the Clyde knew exactly who that meant. Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, an unhappy forced merger of famous old yards, was losing money. And in June 1971, after the government refused a £6 million bridging loan, a liquidator was appointed. 8,000 direct jobs, perhaps 20,000 more in the supply chain. Whole communities, Govan, Scotstoun, Linthouse, built entirely around those yards. And then the men inside did something with no precedent in British industrial history. Led by a shop steward named Jimmy Reid, they refused to strike. They refused to leave. They stayed inside the gates and kept building the ships, a work-in rather than a walk-out, and Reid stood in front of the workforce and laid down the discipline that made the whole country sit up. There would be no hooliganism, he told them. There would be no vandalism. There would be no bevying, because the world was watching them. The work-in ran for 15 months, and the world did watch. And in February 1972, the government blinked. £35 million. Yards saved for a while. It is the one moment in this entire story where the factory floor won. But look closely at what was actually won. A reprieve, not a reversal. A tactical retreat by a government whose underlying belief that the market alone should decide what Britain makes had not changed at all. That belief simply went underground and waited for conditions to improve. Conditions arrived faster than anyone expected, because the 1970s then proceeded to break Britain's confidence in itself. The oil shock, inflation over 20%, the 3-day week, and in 1976 came the humiliation that changed the country's sense of what was possible. Sterling went into freefall, and the Chancellor, Dennis Healey, was driven to Heathrow Airport to fly to an international finance meeting. And the crisis got so bad while he sat in the departure lounge that he turned around, came back, and instead negotiated the largest loan the International Monetary Fund had ever been asked for, nearly $4 billion. The IMF's terms were spending cuts, set from outside. The first industrial nation on earth, the country that had built the workshop of the world, was now borrowing under conditions, like a business in trouble. Whatever won the argument inside Britain next was going to win it completely. What won it arrived in May 1979, when Margaret Thatcher took office and Geoffrey Howe became her Chancellor. Remember that name, because his is the hand that writes the letter. Howe moved fast, and his first great act is one most people have never heard of, which is strange, because you can make a case that it is among the most consequential economic decisions in modern British history. In October 1979, exchange controls were abolished. For the first time in 40 years, money could leave Britain freely. Since the Second World War, British capital had faced strict limits on going abroad, which meant British savings, pension funds, insurance funds, bank lending were largely confined to Britain, available, at least in principle, to British industry. Now the door was opened, and capital did what capital does. It went wherever returns were highest. The city had spent 60 years asking governments to defend the value of money. Now it had been handed something better: freedom of movement. The trading floor was no longer merely Britain's banker. It was becoming the world's dealing room, and whether British factories were part of that world was, from this point on, simply a question of price. And the price was about to go badly wrong. The new government's economic doctrine was monetarism: control the money supply crush inflation, cut borrowing, and let market forces decide which industries lived. Inflation was the stated enemy. The survival of manufacturing was not a stated goal at all. Interest rates were driven to 17% by the end of 1979. North Sea oil was turning sterling into a petrocurrency at exactly the same moment. The combined effect sent the pound up by roughly 30% against Britain's trading partners in 2 years. Sit with that number for a second. A British-made pump, casting or machine tool now cost its foreign customer around a third more than it had 2 years earlier, while the German or Japanese competitor's price stood still. An overvalued pound does not announce itself with a closure order. That is what makes it such a clean instrument. It simply means the order from Hamburg does not arrive. Then the order from Chicago does not arrive. The line goes quiet. The accountant, rather than any minister, signs the redundancy notices, and everyone involved can honestly say that no one decided anything. Between 1979 and 1981, British manufacturing output fell by roughly a seventh, not in a generation, in 2 years. In Consett, the end came on the 12th of September 1980. The steelworks that had made iron on that hill for 140 years closed with the loss of around 3,700 jobs in a town of some 30,000 people, where almost everything else, the shops, the buses, the clubs, existed downstream of the works. Male unemployment in the town rose above 1 in 5, by some counts far higher. And here is the detail that should stop you. Consett was not out-competed. The plant had skilled men, and order books had existed. The steel it made did not stop being good. It stopped being affordable to foreign buyers in currency terms because of decisions taken in London about the value of the pound. The furnaces were cooled. The plant was demolished so completely that within a few years visitors could stand on the site and find it hard to believe a works had ever been there, and the red dust over the town settled for the last time and never came back. By the spring of 1981, what was happening was so stark that British economics produced something never seen before or since. 364 professional economists from across the spectrum signed a joint letter to the Times stating flatly that the government's policy had no basis in economic theory or supporting evidence, and warning that it threatened Britain's social and political stability. 364, not activists, not union officials. The profession itself telling the government in advance, in writing, what the cost would be. The budget was not changed. The course was not changed. Then came the summer of 1981, and the prophecy about social stability stopped being theoretical. Riots in Brixton. And in July, Toxteth in Liverpool, 9 consecutive nights of violence, hundreds of arrests, hundreds of injured police officers in a city where the docks, the factories, and the distribution trades were all collapsing at once. On the 4th of September 1981, with Liverpool still smoking in the government's rear-view mirror, Chancellor Geoffrey Howe wrote in confidence to Margaret Thatcher about what should be done with the city and places like it. He posed the Treasury's question plainly. Should the aim be to stabilize the inner cities, he asked, or was that to pump water uphill? And then he wrote the sentence, "This entire video has been walking toward. Should we rather go for managed decline?" Managed decline. 2 words. the honest name for letting a place die on schedule, spending just enough to keep the process orderly. And Howe knew exactly what he had written, because his very next line was this: "This is not a term for use, even privately. Read that pair of sentences together and understand what you are looking at." A Chancellor of the Exchequer, writing in confidence to his own Prime Minister, reaches for the accurate phrase to describe an option the government is genuinely weighing, and in the same breath orders that the phrase must never be spoken, not in public, not in cabinet, not even between the two of them. The instinct to bury the words was not caution, it was recognition. He knew how it would sound because he knew what it was. Now, this channel deals in evidence, so let us be precise about what this document proves and what it does not. The memo was about Liverpool, not about British industry as a whole. It was one option raised in one letter, and the government ultimately sent Michael Heseltine to Merseyside with a recovery program rather than formally adopting abandonment. Heseltine, to his lasting credit, had toured Liverpool after the riots and fought inside cabinet for active investment, and the argument between the two men is documented. For the record, when the letter was finally released under the 30-year rule in December 2011, Howe told the BBC he had not been advocating managed decline and did not recall how the passage came to be there. His denial is on record. The document is also on record. You can weigh them for yourself. So no, the letter is not an order to close Britain's factories. What it proves is narrower, and in some ways more damning. It proves that at the very top of the British government, at Chancellor level, the vocabulary of deliberate decline existed, was applied to real places full of real people, and was understood by its own author to be unspeakable. The public was told the story had no author, the tide of history, nobody's fault. The paper trail says the people in charge knew better and knew that they knew, and made sure the knowing stayed private for 30 years. And the decade that followed the letter behaved exactly as you would expect if the thinking behind it had never gone away. In 1980, the government had appointed Ian McGregor chairman of British Steel with a one-sentence brief: make it profitable. When he arrived, British Steel employed 166,000 people. When he left 3 years later, it employed 71,000. 95,000 jobs in 3 years, closed by management instruction on a government brief in towns like Consett and Corby and Shotton that had been built for no other purpose. McGregor was then moved to the National Coal Board, same brief, same method, and the miners' strike that followed ran a full year, from March 1984 to March 1985, the longest and most bitter industrial dispute in post-war British history across Yorkshire, South Wales, Durham and Nottinghamshire. The miners went back without a settlement. The union that had once brought down a government was broken, and with it went the last political mechanism capable of making the cost of deindustrialisation unbearable at the ballot box. And then, with the factory floor finally silent enough, the trading floor got its coronation. On the 27th of October 1986 came the Big Bang, the deregulation of the City of London at a stroke, fixed commissions abolished, foreign banks welcomed in. The old trading floor itself, the one with the shouting and the paper, replaced by screens within months, because the whole point was scale and speed. The exchange controls scrapped in 1979 had opened the door for the world's money. The Big Bang built the world's dealing room to receive it. American and Japanese and European banks poured in. The towers went up, and the square mile entered the greatest boom in its long history at almost exactly the moment the last big steel towns were being leveled. The 2 floors of this story had finally received their verdicts. One was demolished so thoroughly that grass grows where the furnaces stood. The other was rebuilt in glass, 40 stories high. The numbers since then tell the rest without any help from me. Manufacturing employed around 6.5 million people in 1979. Today, the figure is roughly 2.5 million. As a share of the economy, manufacturing has fallen from about 30% in 1970 to under 10% today. Britain has run a deficit on its trade in goods every single year since the mid-1980s, nearly 4 decades and counting. Meanwhile, Britain is consistently ranked the largest net exporter of financial services in the world. And before anyone says this was simply the fate of all rich countries, it was not. Of the advanced economies, Britain's fall in manufacturing was among the steepest anywhere, far steeper than Germany, where manufacturing still makes up around 1/5 of the economy, roughly double Britain's share, sustained through deliberate policy choices held steady across governments of every party. The British experience was not the weather. It was specific to Britain, and for a long time it was reversible, until it wasn't. Because that is the cruelest part, the part the economists warned about in 1981 when they spoke of danger to the country's stability. Industrial capability does not wait patiently for the political will to return. When a works closes, the skilled workforce disperses within a few years. Apprenticeship pipelines that took a generation to build collapse inside a single business cycle. The specialist suppliers close first, and without the suppliers, the big plants cannot restart even when someone finally wants them to. And the deepest layer of all, the tacit knowledge in experienced hands, the 1,000 tiny adjustments a skilled steelman or machinist makes without being able to put a single one of them into words, cannot be rebuilt from a training scheme. It has to be lived over years next to someone who already has it. Britain did not just close factories, it deleted the ability to have them. So stand on that hilltop in County Durham today. The air is clean, the views are beautiful. There is grass and light industry and housing where one of the great steelworks of Europe once glowed against the night sky. Nothing about the place tells you what stood there, and that, in its own quiet way, is the point. Then stand in the square mile among the towers, where more of the world's money changes hands than almost anywhere on Earth, and understand that you are looking at the other half of the same decision. Nobody in Whitehall ever signed an order that said, "Close the factories." What the record shows is something different, and in some ways harder to argue against. 5 times across 60 years, when the interests of the trading floor and the factory floor collided, the people in charge were told in advance in writing what the cost to industry would be. Keynes told Churchill in 1925. The advisors told Wilson in 1964. The Clyde told Heath in 1971. 364 economists told Thatcher and Howe in 1981, and 5 times, with the evidence on the table, the same choice was made. Proceeding in full knowledge of the cost is not an accident. It need not be malice, but it is a choice, and the same choice repeated for 60 years, always pointing the same way, stops being a series of accidents and becomes what the man who understood it best almost called it, in a letter he hoped no one would ever read. You always sensed this story was chosen rather than suffered. The paper trail says you were right. If your family's story runs through this one, the works at the end of the road, the make, the town, the year it went, put it in the comments. Those records matter more than the official ones. And the next chapter of this story is the square mile itself, because the strangest thing about the winner of this 60-year contest is that it is not, in any normal sense, part of Britain at all. That story is coming on this channel,